Hello, and welcome to all of our Caltech alumni and special guests. We are thrilled to have you here today at our 81st Annual Seminar Day and to celebrate the 2018 Distinguished Alumni Awards. I am now Julie Newman, class of 2014, and I have had the honor to serve as this year's Seminar Day Committee Chair. I'd like to thank and acknowledge the members of the Seminar Day Committee and ask them to please stand now to be recognized. Each year, Seminar Day gives us the fantastic opportunity to hear from faculty across the divisions of Caltech and JPL who are pushing the boundaries of science and technology. Now, not only our faculty are enlightening us today, though, both Caltech graduate students and undergraduates play an active role in the research of the Institute and are very passionate and articulate in communicating their research. Graduate students will be giving spotlight talks during the 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. sessions today, and you'll have the chance to hear from the undergraduate winners of the SURF lecture competition during the 4 p.m. session. I would highly recommend that you take the opportunity to hear from the next generation of scientists and engineers from Caltech. The student talks get rave reviews every year. Now, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker today, Michelle Feynman. Michelle Feynman is the daughter of Richard Feynman, a name that needs no introduction to a Caltech audience. To Michelle, Richard Feynman was not so much the famous physicist, Nobel laureate, skilled teacher, and, quote, smartest man in the world that we all know him as. To Michelle, he was simply the best father in her world. Today, the world and the Caltech community especially have Michelle to thank for shedding light on the personal life and unique personality of her father through her work. She meticulously compiled, edited, and published hundreds of his personal letters for the now famous book titled Perfectly Reasonable Deviations from the Beaten Track, The Letters of Richard P. Feynman. Michelle has also published 2 other much-loved works, a book of popular quotes and a book of her father's often talked about artwork. Michelle has stayed close to her Southern California roots and is a proud graduate of the Art Center College of Design here in Pasadena. Now she is all the way on the other side of California Boulevard at Polytechnic School as the Assistant Director of Communications and a skilled photographer. She lives in Altadena with her family, just a few miles from where she grew up, the place where her father taught her to ride a bike and to never forget her sense of humor. And to stay in the spirit of that sense of humor, I believe that no good introduction should go without at least one unexpected detail about the speaker. So I'll leave you with this one, which you might come across after some serious internet detective work. While many people have admired her father, others have clearly had their eyes on Michelle. A few years ago, Michelle was nominated by Wired, the popular technology news website, for a rather notable award, Wired's Sexiest Geek of the Year. Today, Michelle is going to share with us what it was like growing up with Richard Feynman as her father. And in honor of what would have been his 100th birthday last week, she has promised to recount some of the lesser-known stories that only a loving daughter could properly tell. Please welcome Michelle Feynman.
Thank you to Caltech and the Alumni Association for inviting me to speak. My father had a unique perspective on life that made his approach to most things unconventional. My mother was fiercely independent and a passionate world traveler, so it's no surprise that I grew up in a family of adventurers. One of our favorite things to do was to take our Dodge van and go camping. We spent a lot of time in California, visited Oregon, and even made it to Canada one summer. We didn't, yeah. We didn't always stay in campgrounds when we traveled. I know that is a campground, but we often didn't because the van had room for us to sleep inside, and so we never had to worry about rain or cold. And with that van, we would go to great lengths to put ourselves in the middle of nowhere. At every fork in the road, we would take the one in the worst condition, the most interesting one. The van was inconspicuous, low-key. No, it had Feynman diagrams painted all over it. My father's adventurous spirit could not be contained to camping with his children in North America, and in 1977, he and a good friend, Ralph Layton, there's Ralph, began their decade-long pursuit to go to Tuva, a small country in outer Mongolia, or just outside. My father had first learned about Tuva collecting stamps as a young boy. Their stamps featured the most interesting shapes and content. They had pictures of camels and yaks, horsemen, archery. They were the shape of diamonds and triangles, and the pictures just had the most fantastic detail. So when my father was a boy, Tuva was an independent country, and he was amazed that they would express their culture in such a simple thing as stamps. Years later, my father interrupted an impromptu geography quiz that Ralph and my brother Carl were in the middle of, with a seemingly simple question: whatever happened to Tuva? Now, knowing my father, Ralph thought he was making it up. So they got the World Atlas out, and there it was, right where Mongolia meets Russia. And looking closer, its capital was spelled K-Y-Z-Y-L. It didn't have a legitimate vowel in it. I mean, so that was it. We had to go to Tuva. In 1977, Tuva was part of the Soviet Union, and travel during the Cold War was challenging. It would have been easy for my father to perhaps give a series of lectures in Moscow and travel to Tuva at the same time, but he didn't want special treatment. As he said, the whole idea is to do things at a lower level, not ride on the freeway and stop at a Holiday Inn. Over the next decade, he and Ralph had a wonderful time learning about that exotic part of the world, even while failing time and again to obtain a travel visa. They spent a lot of time, they spent about a decade trying to get to Tuva, and they had the most outrageous ways to get there, or suggestions. They found the address of someone who worked in the government in Tuva, and they became a pen pal with him. And they painstakingly translated their letters from English to Russian to Tuvan, back from his letters from Tuvan to Russian to English. And this is all before the internet, remember? If we remember what that was like, this is all by hand. They filed all the right papers with Moscow. They even arranged a cultural exchange of Tuvan exhibits at the Smithsonian and also in Los Angeles. My father would never make it to Tuva. The day after my father died, my mother received a letter from Moscow. It was the visa, finally granting my father permission to visit Tuva. My father always insisted that he preferred the journey to the destination. It took me a long time to appreciate that perspective. His own journey started 100 years ago. Richard Phillips Feynman was born in Queens, New York in 1918, was the son of a military uniform salesman. His mother was funny, pragmatic, and sharp. She was in my life until I was 13, and I remember her well. His father had no formal scientific training, but taught Richard the scientific method. And my father, in turn, inspired his younger sister, Joan, there's Joan, to become a physicist as well, which in those days was not the usual course of events for women. He attended MIT as an undergraduate and received his PhD from Princeton University. He married his childhood sweetheart, Arlene Greenbaum, despite the fact that she was ill with tuberculosis, at the time incurable, a death sentence. In 1942, he was asked by the United States government to join the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, and he became a group leader on the atomic bomb project. On the weekends, he would borrow a friend's car and drive to Albuquerque and spend time with Arlene, and he was with her when she died, June 1945. After the war, he became a professor of theoretical physics at Cornell University, and in 1950, he was offered a job at Caltech, where he spent the remainder of his career. In 1960, he married my mother, Gwyneth, and my brother Carl was born in 1962. So this is a picture of baby Carl, my mom, and my dad, and it's an odd grouping, I can see that. It's with one of the awards that my father won, and it represents a very happy and busy week in his life where he literally won an award the day after his son was born. And so I think the newspaper suggested, let's put you in a hospital gown and, take a picture. He won the Nobel Prize in 1965, along with Shinichiro Tominaga and Julian Schwinger, for their independent work on quantum electrodynamics. I was born 3 years later. In 1986, he was again asked to serve his country, this time on the commission investigating the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. When I was very young, we played a lot of games. He had one called the Grip of Steel, in which I was required to wriggle out of a frozen embrace of his arms, the Grip of Steel. I remember running downstairs to grab a roll of paper towels, which I replaced in his still rigid arms. He pretended to be completely outfoxed by my clever thinking, and I delighted in his feigned confusion. Another one of my favorite games was where he would pretend to be a radio. I would sit on his lap and twist his nose, and he would make up songs from different radio stations. On Sunday mornings, he would often forego reading the paper in bed for a wild hour of loud music, drumming, and storytelling with my brother and me. Sitting and swinging on my brother's bed, which was suspended from the ceiling by ropes, I was convinced we were having the best of all possible times. When it was his turn to drive carpool to elementary school, he would pretend to get lost or go to another school or start to drive himself to work. "No, not that way, Dodo," all the kids would say. I can't believe they called him Dodo either. "Oh, all right, is it this way?" And he would turn the wrong way again. "No," we would all scream, absolutely convinced we were going to be late. Somehow, we always made it on time. And looking back now, as a parent, I can't imagine doing half the stuff he did. He loved to cause mischief. When we were at a restaurant and we had to put a name in for waiting for a table, he would spell the name B-J-O with the line through it, R-K, and gleefully wait for the name to be called. Or he would order coffee, and when it was brought to the table, say, "It's for the children." He would pretend to speak Italian in Italian restaurants and converse with our waiter, much to our dismay. It's funny now, but as a teenager, it's embarrassing to have a parent who enjoys public games. When he was at a party and he was introduced to someone who spoke a foreign language, he would pretend to be fluent in their native language. And here's the amazing thing. His resolute confidence and full commitment to the prank often fooled them into thinking that this, kind of gibberish was somehow like a regional dialect that they were unfamiliar with. And they would say, what a shame it was they didn't speak the same version of the language. My father loved teaching. In 1972, he won the Oersted Medal, the highest award of the American Association of Physics Teachers, for his contributions to teaching of physics. 10 years later, he received an award from the Associated Students of Caltech for excellence in teaching. I wonder if any of you had anything to do with that. In his response to the students, he said, "I was very pleased to be honored for doing something that I so thoroughly enjoy." Once, my father was asked about teaching children using his experiences with my brother and me, but he was unable to give a definitive answer because our personalities were so different. My brother liked it when my father made up stories about tiny people who would wander around our house, and Carl had to guess where they were based on the details in the story. It required some imagination because the scale was so unfamiliar. What were trees to these people were actually stalks of the carpet. I didn't like these stories. I wanted to hear the ones out of the book over and over again. Now, my more practical interests served me well, as later my parents trusted me to help them remember tasks that they had to accomplish. And when my father realized that I was the responsible and reliable sort, he tried to get me to do their income taxes. I was 12. My mother told him to stop torturing me. Later, when I was in high school, he started showing me shortcuts in math that disagreed with the teacher's methods. My father didn't believe that there was ever only one prescribed solution to a problem, no single right path. So I got in trouble with my algebra teacher for not solving the problem in the right way. My father thought this was ridiculous, as I had nonetheless arrived at the correct answer, and he went to confront the teacher. So the next day, my counselor called me into her office. She told me when the teacher had found out who my father was, he said that he wouldn't feel comfortable having me in the class anymore. It wasn't the last time I had to transfer out of a math class. When Omni magazine declared my father the smartest man in the world, his mother, who was immensely proud of her son, said, "If Richard is the smartest man in the world, God help the world." My father was the first one to laugh. For many years, I was simply unaware that he was revered as a supreme intellect. He would ask me questions whose answers as a child I found to be painfully obvious, such as, "Hey, Michelle, where do we keep the spoons around here?" Most of the stories he would tell us would be ones that highlighted his ineptitude. Our dinner conversations would be full of stories of Papa's mistakes during the day, like losing his sweater, forgetting something terribly important, having complete conversations with someone and not remembering their name, or feeding our overweight dog twice in one evening because she looked hungry. Or when he called the police to pick up a snake that he saw crawling around in the ivy at the bank, a snake that turned out to be a lizard. He would tell us about his experiences away from home, too, like the time he was disgusted with the fancy hotel where the conference was that he was attending, and so he took his suitcase and slept outside in the woods. My mother would sigh and say, "Oh, Richard," in the exact tone she used for my brother and me. My brother and I would laugh, and my dad would grin over at us. We would hear about the early days of their marriage, about how when they had gone ice skating, my mother turned around and he was flat on the ice with this large, concerned crowd around him. His efforts to learn how to surf had similar success, with him getting hit on the head the first time out. He was not much of a handyman either, for although he understood what had to be done, the actual doing didn't always work out so well. Yet he always laughed at himself, so we would laugh along with him. I grew up with a certain amount of disrespect or irreverence for him that he encouraged. I was in college and still living at home when my father died after a long battle with abdominal cancer. My mother died almost 2 years later, on the last day of 1989, after losing her own battle with cancer. I was still in college and leaned on friends and teachers for support. One teacher noticed that I was kind of just doing what I had to do and not really acknowledging or dealing with the grief, and he suggested that we do an independent study together. And he gave me a photography assignment to take pictures of my house, even of the most mundane objects. So here are some of the pictures I took for that assignment. We also read and discussed Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. I'm grateful to him for forcing me to confront the loss of the two most important people in my life. I graduated from Art Center College of Design in December 1990 and worked for photographers for several years. In 1993, I began to curate a book of my father's artwork. There's his artwork. So the sketch is of me, and then the other one is one that he did, and my brother did the last line. Sorry, can't, you know. And so I also edited 3 books, as Julie mentioned, in his honor. In 2001 and 2003, I welcomed the 2 new most important people in my life, my daughter Ava and my son Marco. In 2009, I was contacted by BBC Radio. They wanted to send me to Tuva with a small crew to document my visit to Tuva and the fulfillment of my father's dreams. When I say small, I mean 1 interviewer, Ilona, and 1 photographer, me. I had misgivings, particularly about leaving my young children behind, but this was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. I had to say yes, so I went. A few months after the email, I was on a plane headed for Moscow. I met Ilona, the woman doing the documentary, and together we flew to Abakan and then drove to Tuva. Next thing I knew, I was in the mountains on a sunny summer afternoon. Watching sticks float down a river, I let my mind wander, trying to imagine my father relishing his time there. And as I pondered what he would have thought of the place, I was jarred back to reality with a woman wearing earphones, holding a large microphone next to my face. It was an uncomfortable experience. For one, every time I spoke into a microphone, I felt as if I was leaving a long message for someone, a message I couldn't take back. I didn't enjoy the lack of control, being taken from place to place on someone else's schedule and constantly being prodded for uncurated, off-the-cuff reactions. Another unexpected problem was my emotions were betraying me. I had a hard time getting through an interview without crying. It had been over 20 years since my father died, and I was no longer crying every time I thought of him, so this reaction surprised and disappointed me. Getting to Tuva, for me, was a relatively easy process, nothing like my father's efforts to visit. I know that the journey was an important part of it for him, and not just reaching the destination, but I had a hard time shaking my guilt. How did I draw the winning ticket? So this was a pervasive emotion for the trip, that I didn't deserve to go. The worst part when I was celebrated in some way. I met the president, they killed a goat for me, I was given the honor of cutting it, or attending a banquet with the family of my father's original pen pal. They were kind, but I put a lot of pressure on myself to do and say the right thing. I felt like I was expected to channel my father in some way, and if I made a mistake, it would somehow reflect badly on him. But Tuvans have a proverb that children fulfill their parents' dreams, and so by my going, I was carrying out his dreams. Weird thing about Tuvans, they are comfortable with strangers. Everyone was incredibly kind and gracious. And when I say strangers, I mean maybe there's even no such thing as a stranger there, because Tuvans can meet someone on the road, and 5 minutes later, they'll be having tea and sharing whatever they have to eat. That behavior had nothing to do with me. That's the open-hearted culture there. So that was completely incredible and great. And I got to spend time with Kongorol Ondar, a Tuvan throat singer, who Ralph had introduced me to 15 years earlier. That was the highlight of the trip. Incidentally, Ralph is over in Tuva right now, celebrating my father's birthday with the Tuvans. You can see photos of the events on Instagram. There's his address. This picture is there's a local shaman performing a ceremony at the unofficially named Feynman Stone. While I was there, we stayed with some nomads deep in the mountainous part of the country. It was very remote. I started to get used to the idea of being recorded and began enjoying the trip. I got to ride a Tuvan horse. They were a little wilder than I was used to, unpredictable. I grew up riding horses, so it was fun. When we came back from the mountains, I spent a day at some beautiful lakes with Kongarol and his family. I remember Ralph had asked me to get a picture of Kongarol in traditional Tuvan clothing with a laptop. And I tried really hard to get that shot. And I remember Kongarol acting like a big brother to me, rescuing me from an overly pushy interpreter. By the end of the trip, I found myself wanting to stay, a far cry from my attitude in the start. I felt like I had only seen a fraction of the country's beauty. In a similar way, I feel that I was only able to experience a fraction of my father. The world may have had him for 70 years, but I only had him for 19. Despite that, I know I have been very fortunate. I was raised and loved by one of the greatest minds in the history of the world. And while he may not have been able to pass down his clairvoyance, an understanding for math, or his passion for learning about how the universe works, he supported me in anything and everything I wanted to do. Together, my parents were able to teach me a few things I hope to pass on to my own children: to laugh at myself, not take anything too seriously, not to sweat the small stuff, and most importantly, to enjoy the journey, whether or not I reach the destination. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle Feynman, so much for sharing those stories with us and being a part of our Seminar Day program. I feel and I know that Caltech alums, our alumni in this community, we hopefully share something with the Tuvans, and that there are no strangers. We're all family. I do want to make sure that everyone's aware there's a special exhibit open during lunch in the Beckman Museum, The Mind's Eye, Richard Feynman in Word and Image, so please take an opportunity to go check that out. I want to thank everybody for being here today. As you can imagine, this weekend, Seminar Day, Reunion Weekend, is a culmination of a ton of hard work. Julie Jester, thank you for being our Seminar Day chair. Thank you to all of the Alumni Association staff, all of the Development and Institute Relations staff, all of the departments on campus, the Seminar Day Committee, all of these people's dedication to Caltech and to this group, Caltech Alumni, is what makes a weekend like this possible. So please join me in thanking them with a round of applause. And with that, I'll say thank you for coming home for the 81st Annual Seminar Day. It's an honor to have everyone back on campus. Please go out, enjoy lunch, and enjoy the rest of your time here. Thank you so much.